Alright, so this is a lecture on Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I guess Ngugi is the last name there, so I'll refer to him as Ngugi. I don't think this will be as long a lecture as some of the other ones, although the text is rather long. I don't find it hard to read, of course, if you're looking at this lecture beforehand. I mean, this is it's a piece of fiction. But like some other pieces of fiction, say like Charles Dickens or something, it's a piece of fiction which is meant to detail real historical period and real events and structures, and that's it. I want to use it very much like we used Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. That is, I want to derive a diagram from it, and the diagram that I want to take from it lays out power relations, governmental relations, relations of control in Kenya in the aftermath of Kenya's independence movement, which in 1962 established the independence of Kenya. It's called the Uhuru movement. Ngugi's criticism of this is that independence was only ever nominal, that it never was real full-on independence. So this is what I really want to do. But I'll do the standard thing first, and I'll try and tell you a little bit about him, something about the context of the writing of the book, and something about the general history that it is looking over, which I would say is very basically 1950 to 1980, could even be 1950 to 1970, the whole period of the independence movement itself, of an armed uprising, guerrilla movement, sometimes referred to as Mau Mau, M-A-U, right there. And extending past nominal independence to a period of what basically Ngugi is laying out as a model of neo-colonialism. That's why I want to give this text. I mean, for one thing, I think it's just beautiful, and it's beautifully written, and it's really harsh, but it's pretty funny. And I mean, out of all the texts in this class, probably, if there was one, if you just didn't have enough reading in this class, and you want to do some more, out of all the books that there are in this class, I'd say this is the one to go read the whole book. I mean, it's just gorgeous, and it has a really strong, surprising, startling, feminist ending to it. But the reason that I included, where I included in the class is in order to start drawing out a picture of what neo-colonialism means. So I'll come back to that. Let's start with him. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a writer and a playwright and a political critic from Kenya who, as far as I know, still works at and probably lives close by the University of California, Irvine. I know at least one person in Dominguez Hills who studied with him. It seems to me that his primary concern nowadays, because I looked for like speeches, talks that he was giving that I could include video-wise in our class, and it seems that his interest, his focus these days is a little outside or a little too specific for this class, which is quite general and wide-ranging historically. What he's interested in, I think fundamentally, is the impact of colonialism upon culture. And specifically, his most recent work seems to have mostly to do with the impact of colonialism upon language, upon indigenous languages. And so when he wrote, this might have been the first book, when he wrote Devil on the Cross, which is what we're looking at, he wrote it in Gikuyu, which is the language spoken by the Kikuyu people in Kenya, who are the majority ethnic group, and the group from which the independence movement sprang, the so-called Mau Mau movement. I say so-called because I've included a couple of documentaries in the content section if you want to check them out, which suggest that Mau Mau doesn't mean anything in Kikuyu. It's a term made up and imposed by British settlers and their government. So there's a problem there. But there was a movement. Anyway, so his interest is in how colonial and neo-colonial relations impact, destroy, alter cultural systems, and especially linguistic systems. And he has put his energy into attempting to resuscitate and defend threatened cultural practices, and especially threatened languages. So he's a fine artist working in a language that most people outside of Kenya don't know. But he's had a long history of writing literature and plays that were extremely critical of the Kenyan government. And he's been to jail multiple times as a result. In the 1970s, he wrote a book called I Will Marry When I Want, which is a feminist book. And it was directly critical of the regime in power at that time, as was an earlier one called Grain of Wheat, and as is this one, Devil on the Cross. I mean, he suffered quite a lot for being such a radical and principled person of integrity, right? This is what I'm actually interested in these writers, people of integrity, people who actually say what is true instead of saying what is useful. I have a lot of respect for that. So this one, he had been put into jail in the late 1970s as the result of the play I Will Marry When I Want, and the book Grain of Wheat. He was in a maximum security prison, and he wrote this book, and he wrote it on toilet paper in the book and smuggled from the prison and smuggled it out. So I mean, that's pretty awesome origin. And it's a comedic but super harsh indictment of what are the real power relations in Kenya in 1980, which I think probably in a whole lot of ways are similar to the present. It's a neo-colonial situation. Generally speaking, what do I mean by neo-colonial? Well, we can talk about the colonial period beginning in a bunch of different ways. And there have been colonies, prior to the dawn of European-based capitalism. The period of colonization, however, that we've been looking at is significant and sort of goes beyond, say, like Greek colonization or Roman colonization or Ottoman colonization. Because, although probably if you look historically, the scope of each one of these colonial movements gets bigger. But there's nothing like globalization until the historical period that we're looking at. And the colonization that begins with the Spanish and then moves up to center on the French and the British and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Germans. This era of colonization is historically distinct because it takes over the whole world. So go back to that lecture on Lenin if you want to think about, like how broad has European and capitalist colonization been. It takes over the whole world to the point where one could argue that the world wars are just the result of the colonists running out of places to seize, such that they have to turn on one another. It's probably important to see capitalism in that violent and aggressive and acquisitive light also, if you want to understand the sort of portrayal that capitalists get in Ngugi's text. So this colonization takes over the whole world, and then it starts to reform itself. It gets shuffled, and it looks like it's weakened, but then it actually potentially strengthens itself after World War II. So we've talked about this history a bit, right? Like after World War II, you get decolonization. And that happens in Asia, especially with Vietnam, and then it happens in Africa, especially beginning with Algeria and Angola, and then coming to include a whole bunch of African nations, including Kenya. This is the period of decolonization, and it gives us many state socialist regimes, which often build governmental structure out of military structure, with all the consequences one could foresee from such a thing, but do so in order to pursue a socialist agenda, at least initially, which involved nationalization of resources and an attempt to take care of the basic needs of the population of a territory on the basis of its own resources. This is decolonization in the 1940s and the 1950s. It goes further in some places than in others. It seems to be relatively successful in Algeria until the 1970s or so, 1980s, at which point they start to sort of fall into civil war. And what happens is that the previous revolutionary regime, in order to maintain its hold on power, ends up having to work out deals which end up being power relations with the very nations that they had separated from the first place. So the Algerian FLN, in order to hold power, ends up being good friends of the French government, which had been, of course, its revolutionary adversary. So decolonization, we have colonization, World War II, decolonization, but then the reestablishment, sometimes the continuation, sometimes the reestablishment of European domination and capitalist domination in the non-European world, the so-called third and second worlds, which is probably racist language in some way. Either the secret continuation, which is what you'll see in Ngugi's text, or the reassertion, the eventual reassertion of capitalist power over these local regimes, which happens in a number of ways, but basically what it amounts to is either an overt or a covert friendship, but really privileged relationship of domination between the rulership of, say, Kenya and institutions like the WTO and central capitalists. They make special relationships with a regime, ideally a dictatorial regime, ideally a repressive regime, but they keep this relationship a little bit in the background so they can continue to say that one or another nation is independent, and they can continue to distance themselves, or so the governments like the US can by lying distance themselves from the harsh practices of the regime which in fact they are propping up. And why are they propping it up? What's the deal? The deal is that a few people in whatever country get magnificently wealthy, and they get magnificently wealthy by getting some of the droppings, some of the table scraps from the multinationals. And what is it that these locals do to deserve these table scraps? They open up resources to multinational exploitation. They open up labor supplies to multinational exploitation. They keep labor supplies cheap by preventing unionization. And they open up markets to allow multinationals to sell things to their country, because capital always wants these few things, right? Resources, labor, and markets. This is neo-colonialism. And wherever there is still a real relationship of domination and exploitation between the previously colonial powers, England, France, Denmark, Germany, and a previously colonial power, you can talk about neo-colonialism. It's changed its form a bit. Kenya is no longer a British asset or British territory, and yet the British ruling class is still, in effect, the ruling class of Kenya. This is the picture that we're getting at. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the historical context in Kenya itself. So Kenya was a British colony, and it was reconstructed along British lines, much the same way that Algeria was reconstructed by the French. Farming was set up to benefit big British farmers. Mining was carried out by British corporations. The Kenyan population became a servile population in regular contact with the rifle butt, the soldier, and the cop. So the whole description that Fanon gives of the colonial world applies equally to Kenya. And if you check out Concerning Violence, that documentary based on Fanon, I think you see some footage from Kenya also. Black people in Kenya were made into an underclass. They were made servants. They were made slave-like, and their lives were held in much more lightly than the lives of the whites. Law protected the whites, not particularly the blacks. The whites had sometimes power of life and death over the blacks without any kind of judicial process. But if there was a judicial process, it would always be a Eurocentric judicial process. By the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s, in this period of decolonization, realize also, one of the things that allowed this reshuffling to happen was the fact that the European powers had beat the hell out of one another in World War II. The potentially and historically colonizing powers were militarily weakened. And it's at this time that multiple parties, multiple guerrilla movements were able to emerge in a whole bunch of previously still colonized territories. And even, in the case of Fanon or in the case of Che Guevara, to hold international assemblies to talk about how to deal with the colonists. So it's in this moment of British weakness that Kenyans start organizing themselves. But I think the key thing to recognize is that they do eventually organize themselves as a guerrilla movement. And it sort of depends which history you read, whether the so-called Mau Mau, that's the guerrilla movement, whether they were successful or whether they were defeated really depends on which interpretation you're reading. But I think the first important thing to recognize is that the initial organizing that was happening amongst the Kikuyu people was not militaristic guerrilla organizing. It was community empowerment organizing, the kind of thing that the Boggses were into. Now, it did bypass the structures of rule which the English had co-opted. So the English had basically bought off certain members of the Kikuyu leadership who, in a lot of ways, also sold out, taking, for example, English names, sending their kids to English schools. And it was these local leaders upon whom the English depended in order to keep subservience in effect. This new wave of organizing bypassed that structure of rule, and so it was perhaps rightly seen as a structural threat by the English settlers. What happened then, though, probably, was that those settlers, they demonized the organizers who they perceived as a threat. And they even gave them a name. They called them the Mau Mau. Now, I'm not sure exactly what is the origin. I don't know the exact detailed history of that term, but I have read in multiple places that the name was imposed from outside. And then all kinds of horrific stories about the murder of whites, rapes of whites, all the kind of racist fantasies which have been prominent in the United States as well, were promulgated. And a whole lot of settlers formed themselves into sort of vigilante groups, and they armed themselves, all in response to this alleged horrific, murderous, sometimes cannibal or kind of sex crime oriented movement of the Mau Mau. So there were all these grandiose and totally fabricated stories about the Kikuyu movement that were circulated. I can hear my son screaming outside. He's freaking out about something. Anyway, a horrific, racially constructed Mau Mau movement was fabricated by the English settlers. And then this justified the systematic rounding up and imprisonment, the putting into concentration camps of thousands and thousands of Kenyans. This was and then a whole wave of police and military violence towards this population. Now, there's of course like a whole long history which leads up to this, which also includes increasing land takeovers by the English, kind of like precarious usage that the English had made of certain portions of the Kenyan population, which stopped working. Anyway, so you can read that whole history if you want. But basically, a guerrilla movement then was formed because of colonial pressure upon community organizers. So they built, basically, through fearing it, the colonial population produced the very guerrilla movement that they were afraid of. This is probably really similar to what happens in many cases of terrorist organization. First, we refer to a group of people attempting to establish some kind of local control over their own local territory, and maybe wanting to push foreign occupiers off their territory. And then we demonize those people, and then we attack those people, and we start systematically rounding up those people and torturing those people and dehumanizing those people. And out of that, we get the very violent, militaristic, ideologically absolutist sort of movement that we claimed was there to begin with. It wasn't. Our fear of it was part of a real material process which actually constructed it. This is something like what happened with the Mau Mau. And then in the course of the 1950s, the colonial government imprisoned a guy named Kenyatta, and they eventually released him. Now, he was supposedly a leader of this movement, but I don't think he really was. I think he was much more closely related to the British colonial apparatus than they let on. And then they let him back out, and he became the leader of the independence movement, and he became the first president of independent Kenya in 1962. It's this transition, the participation in the actual independence movement, also known as the Uhuru movement, freedom movement, through the suppression of that movement, and then the establishment of a new independent Kenyan government, and basically the covert continuation of relationships of property ownership and resource, labor, and market exploitation, continuation of those colonial relations now behind a veil. And the veil is basically the face of black government. This is the period that Ngugi's text refers to, and this is the process which it criticizes. Now, it doesn't criticize the construction of the Mau Mau, but it does refer to the Mau Mau. It rarely uses that term because people involved in that movement didn't use that term. But he does have a couple of characters here in the book who had been involved in that, and they are systematically the heroic characters in his book. Okay, let's see. Now, what about the setup? Just so you can understand when you're reading. The portion that I gave you starts in this cave, so I should explain what's going on with the cave. We have a number of sympathetic characters who have arrived in this cave sort of by accident. They met together in I always mispronounce this, Matatu. which is basically like a little taxi. But they had been invited in various ways to take part in this. What's happening in this cave is something that has been in the story, has been happening all across Kenya. And that is that an organization of Northern European and American capitalists, which is called the International Organization of Thieves and Robbers, the IOTR, has been doing regular meetings at different portions of Kenya in order to establish connections with local thieves and robbers who they can train up to meet their specifications, and then they're going to give these thieves and robbers positions of privilege on condition, of course, that these thieves and robbers advance international theft and robbery, and of course the empowerment of these richest of the people in the world. So this is a what's the word? Not sarcastic, but a parody of the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. That's who these people are. So some people, most of the people who are at this gathering, have been invited because they are important business people, and Ngugi is he's just harshly presenting their practices as nothing but theft and robbery, and he thinks that the people who are really involved in that stuff, they know perfectly well what they're involved in is thievery and robbery, and at this gathering everybody speaks honestly about what's going on. Of course, the whole meeting is overseen by these representatives of the IOTR, which might as well be the WTO, and they are people from the colonial nations of the world, the financial centers of the world. So sitting a little higher than everybody else is the American. And then there's a German and a Frenchman and a person from Japan and some representatives from the Scandinavian nations and Englishmen. Maybe I've skipped one. An Italian. So these people from the centers of European capital have come to oversee a competition where the most deserving of these Kenyan people will be hooked up, will be put in positions of power, will themselves become more wealthy. And basically what they have to show is their cleverness at theft and robbery, and also how they can make themselves useful to international thieves and robbers, from whom, of course, they still have much to learn. This is the idea. Most of the people who are at this gathering in this cave have been invited because that's who they are. But a few people have been invited surreptitiously by what turns out, you don't see it in this chapter, but a student and labor movement which seeks to oppose the actions of the IOTR, which is sort of like the WTO. So like the reading that I gave you, it's already happening at this cave, and we're sort of seeing it from the perspective of these. It turns out some of the people who have been invited there by the student and labor movement were people who are involved in the independence movement, the Uhuru movement. And so we're sort of seeing what's going on from their perspective, and we're appalled like them. I mean, the whole thing is it's a parody. It makes things that are denied by capitalists, but which are arguably dead central to their practice. Exploitation. Buy low, sell high. Make sure that people have a need, develop markets, and then sell high to those markets. Especially pay attention to what resources are available and try to constrain them and try and make money off of them. All of these things, capitalism has like friendly names for them. Business development, working with small communities. What do we have now? Microfinance. There's a scheme. But in Ngugi's book, everything is really called by its name. Everything is called what he thinks it really is, and very harshly. So in this cave, then you get a competition where different individuals try to show how they are the best thief and robber, and therefore deserve to be selected by the IOTR for managerial positions and given access to lines of credit. They want to advance as Kenyan capitalists. And the way in which one advances as a Kenyan capitalist is to form relationships with international capital. How does one do that? One takes steps to improve things for international capital. You do their bidding, they hook you up. Who suffers? Everybody else. This is all explicit in Ngugi's text, whereas in the real world, it's always covered over by a veil of nice language and marketing materials. Okay, so this is what we're witnessing. Now, I want to just focus on, I guess, two things, and then I'll call it quits, because I think this is, you can understand it pretty well by reading it. It's not like it's theoretical or dense. One, I want to talk about just the first few pages where we get this biblical story. I had to look this up. I forget now. It was like a few months ago when I taught this before, but I looked it up and I found the exact passage. I want to say it's like Corinthians or something, but I think I'm just making that up right now. But this is actual biblical passage, which I recognize because I was raised Christian. But I thought that he must have like bent it. But then I went and looked it up and like, no. This is the exact biblical passage. There's some sketchy stuff in the Bible. It's the story of the talents. He starts off with a story. Basically, he's saying like, okay, what happens in the Bible here is what happens between the colonizer people and the colonized people in Kenya. In the biblical story, a big landowner is going away on a trip, and before he leaves, he chooses 3 people who have been very useful to him. And to one he gives, in this story, I think it's like $150,000. To another he gives 100,000. In the Bible, it's called talents. And to a third, maybe it's 50,000. And what he expects is that they're going to make him more money. They're overseeing his money. So he goes away, and the first one invests it, and he gets 100% return. And the second one takes the money, and he invests it, and he gets even more money back, right? But the third one thinks like, okay, so this getting money back, in capitalism they tell you, in capitalist economics, in dominant economics, in your classes today, I bet they tell you that, it takes money to make money, right? And capitalists always like to tell us that they are the ones who bring jobs to our communities, that if we have these businesses of theirs around, we will all be enriched, that capitalism produces wealth, and in producing wealth, then it distributes wealth through wages and so forth, and it makes people rich. Wealth comes from capital. This is the capitalist perspective, one, of course, to which people like Marx are very much opposed. Oh, and by the way, Ngugi, at least early on, is pretty clearly, it's like a Fanonist Marxist. He buys Fanon's analysis of the colonial world, but they both have this Marxist backdrop. So when he comes back, the owner is very happy with the first 2 people who have shown him that they can be good custodians, and that even if he's going to be absent, and of course this is like leading up to the absence of the colonial lord from the colonial territory, and thus neo-colonialism versus actual historical colonialism. He wants to be able to operate from a distance and have these people who have been his servants, who are of course therefore in a way traitors to their people, because they serve the interests of an oppressor from outside instead of serving the interests of their own general population. Allegorically, the story is about good servants of the colonists. But then there's a third person in this story who is given this money. And he's like, I've been having these suspicions. The capitalists always tell us that capital is auto-productive, that it makes more capital. Money makes more money. And that's why you should be so happy when investors show up in your world, in your community, because we depend on them for the generation of wealth. I've always been told the story, but I'm wondering about it a little bit. So he takes his talents, or whatever, and he buries them in the ground in a box. And he's like, well, let's see if this stuff reproduces itself. And the master comes back, and the servant digs up the box, and there's only the same amount of money that he was given, nothing more. He gives it back. He's like, hey, look, I didn't take any, but I learned something. What I learned is that you've been lying to us. The capitalists have been lying to us. They always tell us that their money, their investment, generates wealth. But if you don't take that money and put it into the context of labor, if you don't drench it in the sweat of the workers, there is no valorization. There is no capital accumulation. No more money is made. So wait a minute, where did the profit come from? Where did the wealth come from? Did it come from the capital, or did it come from the suffering and the labor of the working classes? It's the latter. So now I know, he says, now I know who you are. You know, you told us that you were a savior and a patriarch, but you're an imperialist, and you're a colonist, and you're a thief. And the phrase that he uses, which really sticks with me, is like, you reap where you do not sow. You reap where you have not sown, meaning that other people put the seeds in the ground, do the labor to cultivate and water and raise whatever is the thing, the wealth. And then you come along and you harvest it and you take it and you buy a Rolls Royce for yourself. Sorry, I forgot where I was. So this third servant has discovered that the master is not a good master, but a damn thief, an exploiter. And then the master responds, okay, I'm very satisfied with these first two servants. They've done what I wanted. They've shown that Kenya is a good environment for investment. But the third one, this one who has unveiled my real name, imperialist, and has pointed out that I reap where I do not sow, him, we're going to arrest him, put him away forever, torture him, beat the shit out of him. Maybe we're going to have to kill him. Because that person is going to go start talking to other people, and we're going to have unionization efforts. We're going to have resistance of all forms. We cannot have that. Okay. So, now what's the last thing here? The last thing is a claim that though independence took place, that independence was only nominal, was not complete, was not for real. And the reason that it wasn't for real in Kenya in 1962, but by extension, and a whole bunch of other African, Asian, Southeast Asian, Indonesian situations, places that used to be colonized, they become independent, but their independence is fake. What's really going on? What's really going on is that the colonial powers saw their weakness, saw that there were going to be these large uprisings, and in many cases sort of just cut their losses. But they also figured out a way to continue their relations of exploitation, sometimes even at less cost to themselves, because maintaining a colonizer base, maintaining a military force, police force, governmental force, these are expensive things. If you can get somebody else to do all that stuff for you, but still be able to take all the resources you want, utilize the labor at super cheap rates, and then get even more value out of the country by selling stuff to them. If you could do all that without having to live there yourself, that'd be even cheaper. And that's what they succeeded in. So what he's saying is that specifically in Kenya, the British colonists chose members of the Kenyan elite who had historically already been in bed with the English. They chose, in Fanon's text, these are the colonized elite. The people whose interests were already aligned with the interests of the English. And that's what was making them special. That's what was making them elite. That's what was allowing them to send their kids to London. And the fact that their kids went to London for school provided them with a kind of social prestige when they came back to Kenya. Of course, Ngugi is appalled at all this stuff. And you can see these comments throughout the text where he's talking about how these people's kids can't even speak Gikuyu, can't even speak their own language. They only speak English, and they have these silly-ass English names. But the colonists chose those people, including Kenyatta. So this is an indictment of the leader Kenyatta. And set them up to be the leadership in the aftermath of colonialism. So they set everybody up. They say, now, you just guard our assets here. See what you can do with them. See if you can make some more money there for us. And if you do, we're going to hook you up even more. We're going to make you a manager at our bank. Because, of course, we've got European-based banks that have branches all over the place. We're going to give you access to lines of credit, which will allow you to develop businesses and figure out how to exploit people in a whole bunch of different ways. And a large part of this reading is just talking about different ways of exploiting people. And it focuses on the fact that exploitation has to do with producing a need for air, for water, for land, identifying like a real baseline need, the kind of stuff that Robespierre talked about. And then forcing that commodity into scarcity and then charging high for it. So you're going to be in a position to be able to exploit the rest of the Kenyans, provided that you act in such a fashion as to optimize our profits. And this, Ngugi is saying, this is what happened. That independence happens, and so the rebellion, seeing a black person in government, is like, hey, well, we got what we wanted. We have a Kenya for Kenyans. It's black Kenya. Hallelujah, the English are gone. But the thing is that the English are not gone. The capitalists are not gone. They have simply worked out a new arrangement with a new government. So Kenya gets to have something like cultural autonomy, but this isn't true either. They just get to have black leadership, but that black leadership still has no allegiance to the general population. It's not doing the interests of the population. It's continuing exactly the system of capitalist exploitation that was in place previously, and it's doing it under show of force. It still has a military, still has a prison system, still has practices of torture and all the rest, to make sure that people who mess with the system are going to be made ineffective, pulled out of the running. So you've got just the same system, with the exception that the leadership is now, I want to say indigenous, local, because the point here is this is not just Kenya. This is all kinds of places all over the world, where you then end up with hyper unfree regimes, dictatorial regimes, who are doing the bidding of multinationals abroad. Now those multinationals, their government doesn't have to pay for the working conditions that they prefer, non-unionization, low wages, and so on. The local government is going to take care of that, and all you got to do is basically pay off a few people, a few thieves and robbers in key positions in order to reap where you have not sown, to reap the advantages of Kenya even better than you did it when you took that land over by force. This is the story that Ngugi is offering us, and this is the structure that I'd like you to think about. Think about, doesn't that structure exist in a whole bunch of places across the globe?